Good evening. Hello. I'm Judith Angel from Transit in Sky in Bratislava. And this evening's lecture takes place in the framework of the Nature Red in Tooth and Claw exhibition, which is visible in our space until mid of March. Central to the exhibition are the concept of immunity, explored from a multidisciplinary perspective, and the politics of the body, especially the female body and its representation, placental politics, biomedical practices. I'm welcoming our guest, today's lecturer, writer, and independent scholar Sophie Lewis, and Hana Janečková, curator of the exhibition, initiator of the lecture, and moderator of the subsequent discussion. Before giving the floor to Hana, I'd like to express our thanks to Erste Foundation, main partner of Transit, and the Slovak Arts Council, supporter of the exhibition and this program. Hana, please, it is your turn. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Especially, I would like to say thank you to Sophie Lewis for accepting our invitation to the program, and thank you, Judith, for introducing the lecture and for inviting me to collaborate with Transit on this exciting 4 months project. The exhibition can be seen for next 2 weeks, so if you haven't seen it and find yourself in Bratislava, please visit Transit and you can see the rest of the show. This lecture sort of series are part of a live program. We've previously had designer and artist Serena Tarkanian, curator and researcher Zuzana Jakalová, social anthropologist Andrej Bělák, and Stanko Dolan joining us a week ago in person in Bratislava. And hopefully this exhibition might have one more, apart from today's lecture, we might have another talk with British artist P. Staff later in April. So we will let you know about this. And when it comes to Nature Red in Tooth and Claw, as Judith mentioned, it is a program that kind of deals with questions of immunity from the positions of post-human and sort of socio-political interpretation of these topics. So it's a research-based program where we've been looking at themes like quarantine, racial segregation. We've been examining strategies of transfeminist biohacking, and I'm incredibly grateful and thankful to all the artists and theoreticians and curators who took part in it. So now I would like to introduce our guest, which is Sophie Lewis. Sophie Lewis is, we've been incredibly honored that she accepted our invitation. Sophie Lewis Sophie Lewis is a writer and independent scholar living in Philadelphia. She's currently at work on a third book manuscript entitled Enemy Feminisms, which is forthcoming with Haymarket Books. Her first 2 books are Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, which I will happen to have here, and Abolish the Family, Manifesto for Care and Liberation, which you can also get in Czech translation. It is this red book here. It was published with Transit only recently. Sophie's essay and articles appear in academic journals and feminist academic journals like Feminist Theory, as well as literary ones like N+1. Sophie has a PhD in geography at Manchester University, as well as an MA Politics from the New School and a BA in English Literature from Oxford University, which was followed by MSc in Environmental Policy, also at Oxford. Dr. Lewis teaches short courses at Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, which are open to all, so you can also join because they are also online. She also has an unpaid visiting affiliation with the Center for Research on Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And for today, before just very shortly, Sophie's talk will take us to India, and she will focus her talk will focus on connection between commercial gestational surrogacy and giant gas leaks that were caused by Union Carbide Corporation. And she will ask questions like how, when what comes around, how can we forge sort of kinship and across sort of borders and boundaries of this like giant leaks, and especially looking at the question of like commercial surrogacy and surro-babies that are sort of commissioned by parents from global north, and they are traveling back to global north from India. So I will pass now on to Sophie. And if you have any questions, this is an important bit. If you have any questions, please post them in YouTube. Can you use post the comment? It will be we will see it in our chat, and Sophie will talk for about like 50 minutes. So all the questions will be answered after those 50 minutes. But you can like ask questions anytime. Yes. So I will pass to Sophie, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Hana. Everyone can see the slides, I assume. Great. The phrase, "we are here because you were there," is an old commonplace of immigrant-led anti-imperialist politics. It's a basic analysis of the reason why former subjects of empire might be resident in an inhospitable metropole. So to paraphrase, we live among you now because before you came and colonized us. But why would such an explanation be necessary? Because, of course, the speakers are finding themselves unwelcome, interpolated by the you of the slogan into a them rather than part of an us. The slogan addresses this supposedly autochthonous authority, which views the speakers as aliens, uninvited guests, intruders, whose presence needs to be accounted for according to the rules of the dominant culture, rather than greeted, as in other societies, ancient traditions, or, treated to the special hospitality due to the stranger. To explain why one is here becomes necessary when hospitality is withheld, when one is faced with xenophobic sentiments such as, go home, go back to where you came from, and so on. So one ends up protesting in self-justification. Listen, we also wish we were not here. Don't be surprised. Tolerate us. Our lives in this location are actually caused by something you did. So this implication in the end is that were it not for colonial history, there might be some justification for refusing to give welcome and to share space. Implicitly, we wouldn't be here in this, trumped up colonial shithole had we more choice in the matter. That's the subtext. Or to pursue this vein even further, we are here in the same way that you were there. In other words, we are here to extract and subjugate. The logic could be that our immigration to the so-called core from the so-called periphery is a kind of counter-colonization or a sort of karmic cycle of history, a reversal or a reciprocation in kind, even a form of vengeance. So the phrase, "we are here because you were there," at minimum, rings out as a reminder that Europe was built by the rest of the world, i.e., that you, Western man, are still here simply because we have been. So as I'm hopefully making clear, and as Amber Doe's artwork by the same name evokes, it's a deceptively complex slogan, right? On one level, it appears to be ceding to the terms of a neo-colonial order, almost pleading not to be held responsible for a trespass that is history's fault. On another level, in its rather sort of conspicuous explanatory insufficiency, vis-a-vis a question that makes very little sense, why are you here? It casts doubt on the validity of its own premise. It points beyond itself in this way, shaming the subject of xenophobia that it appears to want to appease. Why would you question anyone's freedom to be here simply because they want to be, or indeed for no reason at all? Why do you feel entitled to an account of why someone is here, sharing your homeland? Indeed, given the lethal character of the colonial enterprise throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, isn't it more apt to say, we are here despite the fact that you were there where I am from? I've survived. Let's go back to basics for a second. Where do people come from? It's obviously a little bit hilarious to be posing this question in a scholarly and artistic setting, as opposed to an intimate conversation about the birds and the bees with a very young person. But sometimes the most basic things are precisely what we have to re-narrativize. Where do people come from? Well, people come from the bodies of other people. People whose molecules are basically the same molecules as those of our own fetal selves, via the protection against full-blown invasion afforded to her by the hemachorial placenta, pictured here. The uterus haver works metabolically in order to make more human flesh, building fetal eyeballs, fetal bone tissue, and so on. And just to dwell on this for a moment, those molecules are the same molecules in a sense as the uterus haver's molecules. Where else would they have appeared from? Gestator and gestatee are always genetically completely different, and yet at the same time, they're made of the same blood and guts. In other words, the bodies aren't one, but they certainly aren't two. Or perhaps if the body isn't quite two, it also isn't exactly one. Chikako Takeshita has proposed a noun for grasping this situation, the mother fetus, one word. She offers this as an alternative ontology of the pregnant body, in order to collapse the material distinction between the maternal and the fetal, and insist that we must learn to think the mother fetus holobiont as a boundary-breaching cyborg figure engaged in symbiotic and symbiogenetic co-production. I know that's a lot of long words. I'll get into that in a minute. Takeshita's intervention is basically so salutary because it begins to move us beyond the discursive gridlock whereby feminists have sought decade on decade to fight a more than human liberation struggle on traditionally humanist terrain. If you have heard of this traditional feminist talking point about the etymology of the word individual, this won't be news to you. The word individual excludes the female, defined according to reproductive capacity by its very definition. The core concept here has always been sovereign indivisibility, and hence explicitly exclusionary of uterus-bearing, i.e. potentially multiple and thus divisible anatomy, meaning the individual who gets to make claims like my body, my choice, is by definition not a pregnant person. The pregnant person is by definition not an individual in that traditional sense. So when Black and white and Indigenous feminists the world over have started saying my body, my choice, be that in reference to forced sterilization or access to abortion or the right to gender-affirming healthcare or freedom of sexuality, we are traditionally invoking, in a strategic sense, this liberal humanist premise of property in the body. And to some extent, this has worked, although reactionary and anti-feminist deployments of the very same biopolitical claim, my body, my choice, towards deeply anti-social and anti-feminist ends have always been co-present. Naturally, one standard response to the, etymology that I just outlined for you is a simple refutation, right? Nonsense. Of course, she is. Of course, the pregnant person is an individual. And like the vast majority of feminists, I have tended to agree with the reasoning behind this move to some extent, at least tactically speaking, in the sense that individualist body sovereignty principles or property in the body discourses are basically what we have available to us right now as reproductive rights or reproductive freedom or reproductive justice activists in most capitalist societies. It's at least what we have available to us so far for the purposes of making the case that no one should ever be pregnant against their will, not even for the smallest amount of time. According to the standard feminist pro-choice framing, the divisible person must be empowered at all costs to become indivisible. Again, that is to say, individual, if she wishes. After all, some of the components in the mother fetus are much, much more equal than others, right? One of them is a person, whereas the other is a proto-person. Both are attached very asymmetrically to an aggressively extractive and protective apparatus, the placenta, that mediates between, but which is geared very much to preserve the life of the fetus over the life of the gestator when push comes to shove. That's just the bad luck of our species in terms of the design of the placenta that we have to work with. So because of that, and if for no other reason, there are other reasons, but simply for that reason alone, any reason and no reason at all are good enough to pull the plug, especially given how threatening the apparatus is to the adult's health and even her life, right? To me, there's no doubt about it ethically. What the pregnant person wants is what goes. In pregnancy, it's particularly obvious that what goes around comes around. You are here because of me is not the way I would justify an abortion. I think we could consider the much more difficult alternative. You are part of me, and I have the prerogative to cut you off. because I have the prerogative to cut me off. I actually agree with the fascist proponents of forced gestating on one tiny point, which is that ethical consideration toward fetuses should be on our list of things to think about. I want to get to a place where giving fetuses ethical consideration has become materially possible. But at least until the day when gestating is a lot less dangerously invasive of a process for a body to undertake, until the day that it can be, who knows, partially automated or handed off to a third party, what a fetus wants is really completely immaterial. As I say, this is my position politically. Abortions are a public good, not only a necessary evil. However, besides sovereign individualism, there are other ways of getting to that conclusion. Other response strategies can be worth entertaining in the face of the assertion that a pregnant person is not an individual. We could experimentally, you know, when the fascist proponents of forced birth say things like this, like, is it really just your body? You know, we could experimentally respond, you know, you're completely right. No, of course not. You know, a body does not have 2 heads, 4 hands, 4 legs, 2 beating hearts, and 2 different sets of DNA. A body has so much more things in it than that. We could contemplate saying, okay, yeah, the pregnant person is not an individual, and ask instead, what is she then? And just to be clear, she may not be a she at all. The answer for some theorists in, you know, the new materialist humanities and the sort of more traditionally sort of Marxist parts of the post-humanities alike is somewhere in the domain of words I've already mentioned: cyborgicity, the concept of the holobiont. So, you know, thinkers like Astrida Neymanis, Donna Haraway, and Takeshita, who I already mentioned, are interested in using gestationality not as the sort of special or only framework for entering into this kind of, you know, more than individualist ontology, but as a useful way, one way amongst many. You know, to my chagrin, you know, a majority of, you know, Marxist human geographers or ecological thinkers are not necessarily interested in grappling with this more than human reality of the biology of the human. I think it is important to try. Those of us who are not pregnant cannot be confident that we aren't also divisible, deconstructible, for instance, into myriad symbiotic populations of beings with distinct DNA. We're full of bacterial cultures and microorganisms. We are, all of us, in a sense, you know, pregnant like this. Microchimerism is the scientific term for the cross-colonization that takes place in literal pregnancy, which is the production process whence we all originate, whereupon the pieces of DNA left behind by a fetus float around the adult's body for the rest of their life, and vice versa. Pieces of the gestator's DNA co-constitute the body of anybody born in perpetuity. So babies, once they've emerged from someone's abdomen, are once drastically helpless and unfinished, and therefore sort of new in a unique and extraordinary way, and in a sense also very old, already damaged, already riddled with the fumes of history. and not to mention saturated with microplastics. In any case, that's where people come from. And I'm glad we got to go over that together. One word for the process I've just outlined is anthrogenesis, the making of the human. And as I've hopefully evoked, when one starts to track the material trails of anthrogenesis, it becomes hard to limit its purview to persons with literal placentas. As you may already know, I have long been interested in the politics of anthrogenesis, the agonism of anthrogenesis. I've written again and again about the, all too infrequently discussed ripping and tearing and fighting that goes along with the biology of placentation and parturition in our species. I'm not at all anti-pregnancy. I'm a awestruck, admirer of the extreme sport that is this, xeno-hospitable endeavor that costs so many people, 300,000 people a year, as far as we know, their lives. I think it's bananas that anybody should be ever expected to do it against their will for even a second. But the heuristically generative boundary trouble of this kind of bodily xeno-hospitality, which is to say hospitality towards the alien, is something that I wish to politicize from a comradely as well as a critically utopian sort of anti-work perspective. How does the politics of anti-work in the domain of the all-important work of care work? To an extent, as I wrote in the final chapter of Full Surrogacy Now, my first book, bodies are always, parasited, leaky, non-unitary, and thus involved in the making of one another. The vital and varied flora and bacteria that swirl through and between everybody, not just ones that are literally gestating, makes a mockery of the concept of bodily autonomy, especially but not exclusively during pandemics. And that is not, of course, to say that bodily autonomy isn't paradoxically at the same time an overwhelmingly important principle. So this is something where we would get into the dialectic of care and autonomy, and how we cannot have one without the other in a meaningful way. In the accounts of earthly life given to us by, dialectical biologists and feminist biologists like Lynn Margulis, we are all revealed to be disconcertingly pregnant with myriad beings, some of which are even simultaneously sort of gestating us back, i.e., providing crucial developmental functions on our behalf. And this is also, very much, I'm sure, familiar terrain for those of you in this field, who will have encountered, I'm sure, the sculptural work of Patricia Piccinini, and this returns us to the word I used earlier, symbiogenesis, which I can now unpack with reference to this art which Donna Haraway has written about in an essay called Speculative Fabulations for Technoculture's Generations. This is, as I believe the curators of this event mentioned, a way of me sort of circling back, returning back to my earlier work on the question of surrogates, helpers, carriers, and invisibilized gestators, sort of cut out of the family photograph. In Piccinini's oeuvre, we find again and again these sorts of haptic meditations on xeno-hospitality and xeno-solidarity, which are not, I think, straightforwardly utopian, certainly not romantic or comfortable or easy visions. These hyper-real beings in Piccinini's Surrogate series are typically pseudo-white, a whiteness that the sort of equally hyper-real pink skin of the creatures of the other species highlights uncannily. The humans' vulnerabilities are being tended to by these stoical, albeit sometimes quite threatening, non-human companions in what appears like a one-way flow. The mutants are holding and nourishing the humans. They seem like they might be unthanked, unacknowledged, maybe sometimes even unseen in some of the sculptures. So perhaps in Piccinini's settler colonial Australian context, the labors of species contaminating care and kinship practices represented here, benefiting white people, are in a sense undeserved, certainly unreciprocated. I also don't think Piccinini is saying anything as simple as, this isn't okay. After all, care is always asymmetrical. It does not need to strive to be symmetrical exactly. That is not perhaps what justice and equality means when it comes to care. Anyway, Haraway recodes class consciousness here as a kind of multi-species responsibility. She spells it responsibility, the ability to respond ongoingly to intimacies of distributed reproduction. And I think the point of these projects, as in Piccinini's and Haraway writing about Piccinini, is very much like mine, to try to rub our faces collectively in continuities between the biomes and flesh worlds that centuries of capitalist ecology have sapped, disabled, and rendered toxic, and the bodies that settlers especially like to think of as our own sort of neatly bounded family tree. So these sorts of kinships we would rather disavow, these kinships we would rather not claim. Briefly, like Donna Haraway's 1985 sort of socialist manifesto for cyborgs, my title, Full Surrogacy Now, has a simultaneously descriptive and prescriptive, utopian and dystopian valence. So descriptively, when I said full surrogacy, I'm referring to a reality that is already here, as in we are all very much the makers of one another already. In the other sense, in Haraway's sense, we are all already non-innocent cyborgs, whether we like it or not. It's not a pretty reality. It's just an unwelcome reality. At the same time, it is a prescription, an invocation that we have to collectively recognize this fact that we are already very unjustly, exploitatively, extractively, disavowedly surrogated, and that there is a sense in which we have to face this in order to realize its full potential and actualize it. The fact that we are each other's harvest requires that we learn to act like it and build a world worthy of that recognition. The practical collective skills, I think, are involved in cultivating this as a matter of urgency, could be called, amongst other things, amniotechnics. This is one tool I propose in the toolkit required. I propose amniotechnics as the name for the art of holding and caring even while being ripped into. Think of Piccinini's surrogates again there. at the same time as being held. Amniotechnics is protecting water and protecting people from water at the same time, recognizing that we are made not so much underwater as in water, in the uterus, being water ourselves, which is to say water in water. Our wateriness is our surrogacy. It is the bed of our bodies overlap, and it is not necessarily, but possibly a source of radical kinship. The art of caring for water in full recognition of its death-dealing inhumanity and unromantic necessariness to life, full recognition that it's a kind of frenemy within, as I also say, is one aspect of the art of living on a damaged planet, to recall Anna Tsing's phrase. After Fukushima, Jean-Luc Nancy writes about the catastrophe of meaning to which humanity collectively is being exposed in the wake of combined and uneven ecocide. He writes, let us remain exposed. Let us think about what is happening to us, ce qui nous arrive. And if the Anthropocene calls to imagine humanity written into the rock of the earth itself, capitalism is the instrument of this brutal inscription. For it is not the products of humanity that will come to be stratified, but the externalities of Monsanto and Dupont. Okay, first off, this idea that it is we who are arriving or leaving seems to me a promising modification of the terms of encounter with Xenos, the stranger, which we looked at the beginning, whereby the firmly rooted citizen rejects the ancient imperative of Xenia and considers herself not implicated, not a part of the coming and going of immigrants who are here because she, in a sense, was there. And in this ecocidal moment in which so much of Earth is becoming uninhabitable, in other words, our leaving and arriving will always and henceforward be mutual, or it will not be. All borders of nation states closed to migrants must self-evidently be opened, given the uneven yet radically combined character of climate catastrophe. And there are two things else in Nancy's reflections that jump out at me. This phrase, products of humanity, and the word stratified. Stratified reproduction is a phrase advanced by the anthropologist Shelley Colon, author of The Global Politics of Reproduction, in order to capture simply what baby making in a global class society looks like. In essence, it is structured like a layer cake. Where's my layer cake? I think I forgot to bring the layer cake in. It's basically what I mean by full surrogacy in the dystopian sense, with all the cream reserved for the mothers, the babes and infants of the upper crust. In Jean-Luc's usage, of course, it refers to the buildup of rock and fossil formations he is suggesting will henceforward be interspersed with substances like the plastiglomerate rock that queer science scholar Heather Davis thinks with in plastic matter, this kind of millefeuille. Oh, there's the cake on the left. A layering of chemical history, which he said is being written not by humans, but by capital. And I totally get what Nancy wants to say. We are living in the Capitalocene, not the Anthropocene. For instance, because large swathes of indigenous humanity have had little role in geoengineering planet Earth beyond human habitability. I just can't accept that the products of humanity can be cleanly separated from the externalities of the vast multinational chemical technoscience and fossil fuel conglomerates. To paraphrase Donna Haraway, the machine is us. It's up in our business, it's in our placentas, and so on. I understand the logic behind separating out that which humans seek to make and that which capital wreaks. But to some extent, separating them is nevertheless impossible. When the labor power we sell congeals into commodities, it leaves its trace on the effluents in the tailing ponds, leaching into the groundwater and ultimately financing the fossil record of this planet. And that's just our directly market-mediated labor. As a feminist, influenced both by Haraway and by the social factory thesis of the autonomist feminists of the Wages for Housework Committee, I understand the materiality of social reproduction to be part of the same circuits of valorization as waged commodity production. So this phrase, social reproduction, for me, very much includes anthrogenesis in the sense of making and remaking human life. Not just, unfortunately, in the service of the perpetuation of markets, but also, in the biological sense, because the two cannot neatly be separated if they ever could. I think I'll have to be brief when it comes to wages for housework, but in case of a lack of familiarity, this was a utopianist platform that issued a kind of directional demand for money and time with a view to one day doing away with both wages and housework. They were early 1970s feminists advancing, amongst other things, the idea that every miscarriage is a workplace accident because every pregnancy, paid or unpaid, is a form of labor. And they grappled with the fact that this unpaid childbearing and housework was productive for capitalism without seeking to actually, find a way to organize it that would be acceptable. They wanted to explode the whole structure. We have to try to be dialectical about things in the manner of the Wages for Housework Committee. Social reproduction activities such as caring are often a major, if not the only or the paramount source of satisfaction that we have to gain in this world, even as they are simultaneously value-producing labors that are being hollowed out from under us and stolen from us by the hydra-headed system of endless accumulation. And I take that exact insight from the Cyborg Manifesto. Haraway told us, careful not to romanticize. The cyborg is born as the cyborg enemy. The death-dealing machine is in a sense, our kin as well, at least for the time being, and certainly for the foreseeable. The flesh of our loved ones is densely scribbled on by capitalist metabolisms, toxicants, carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, plastics. We have to let go of our normative attachment to the ideal of undamaged life. And as CRIP theory and science and technology studies and queer environmental humanities scholars are increasingly teaching us, humanity and humanities products are objectively not separate, right? From, as I keep saying, from the processes of laying waste, of destructive productivity that Nancy indexes with the words Monsanto and DuPont. Our adult and neonatal bodies alike are full of microplastics. For one example, many types of plastic directly inhibit the human ability to reproduce procreatively. And so on account of its almost infinite longevity, Heather Davis proposes plastic should perhaps in and of itself be understood as a non-filial human progeny, a bastard child that will most certainly outlive us. So how do we care for plastic offspring? And how do we care for the many poisoned mothers of humanity's products and capital's byproducts? Okay, in 2014, I watched a talk by the feminist neuroscience scholar Deboleena Roy on YouTube, which is a piece of research I've very briefly mentioned in Full Surrogacy Now. But as you can see, I never forgot this talk, and I'm still fascinated, and I wanted to tell you about it today. It was entitled Germline Ruptures, Methyl Isocyanate Gas and the Transpositions of Life, Death and Matter in Bhopal. And in her talk, Roy pointed to a uniquely poignant aspect of the fallout from what is commonly accepted as the world's worst industrial disaster, an aspect that immediately suggested to me the phrase, "What goes around comes around." Because, as Sharmila Rudrappa has also shown, populations in India that were targeted for reproductive desistance, desistance via sterilization, Planned Parenthood education, and even environmentally racist chemical, architectural, and urban planning decisions. In a gruesome twist of history, those very populations all too often became the very same ones targeted precisely to have the reproductive capacities harnessed for domestic purchase, and also chiefly for export in the medical reproductive tourism industry in particular. And this reproductive capacity, which in the past, as I say, was disciplined and silenced, is now harnessed and promoted intensely, or it was until recently, because the legislative situation has changed drastically since Roy's talk. But for a time in India, surrogacy as a form of reproductive assistance for export was promoted intensely by the Indian government. And so the possibility is strong that the toxicant affected surro-babies of gestational surrogate workers in this area have returned a modicum of this kind of methyl isocyanate gas mediated animacy back to America, where Union Carbide was founded, in a kind of loop of queer poetic justice. We are here because you were there. But before I go on, I'll clarify this. I just want to refresh our collective memories about the Bhopal disaster, right? The tragedy in question occurred in early December 1984. It consisted of a gargantuan explosion of this MIC, also known as carbaryl gas, what I've been referring to as methyl isocyanate, from the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Madhya Pradesh, India. And the plant manufactured Temic and Sevin, which were popular brands of carbamate pesticides of the type used in the 1950s and 60s Green Revolution in agriculture. These were some of the adverts, which I think have been received as almost diabolically prescient and uncanny because of the way they're on the left here, showing a kind of Western hand, seemingly poisoning an Indian landscape. These are organic compounds that kill insects by attacking their brains and nervous systems. And according to best estimates, when a large quantity of tank cleaning water was accidentally poured into the container full of methyl isocyanate at the plant, the heat generating chemical reaction that was triggered directly killed 20,000 human beings, either instantly or in the initial 2 to 3 months of the aftermath. But even that number fails to convey the fact that the tragedy is still, to this day, actively unfolding, with the uncleaned up pollution still meeting myriad forms of slow violence out to hundreds of thousands more people via groundwater and food production, but also via bodies themselves in the form of heritable nervous, respiratory, and reproductive toxicity. Union Carbide, by the way, was bought out by Dow Chemical 15 years later. and survivor-led organizing has never ceased. Many lifelong activist survivors have called not only for Union Carbide and then Dow Chemical to compensate and clean up, but also for funding for ongoing scientific research, reproductive monitoring, genetic screening of the victims and their families, because no responsibility either by Union Carbide or by Dow Chemical has ever been forthcoming. 4 days after the tragedy, the company's chairman, Warren Anderson, was arrested under the order of the Indian government. Immediately on arriving in the capital of Madhya Pradesh, but after being held under house arrest for only a few hours, Anderson posted bail and quickly left the country, never returning to face trial. In 2015, activists publicized the fact that Narendra Modi had been dining lavishly with representatives of Dow Chemical, a company that has been recently hailed, I kid you not, as woke by virtue of having a gay CEO. Deboleena Roy drew on a broad range of scientific evidence, claiming that MIC and its metabolites have left their mark and continue to interact with the hormones, tissues, the DNA, both somatic and gametic, of reproductive activity in the Bhopali population. As is quasi-invariably the case within the logic of surplus life and environmental racism, this impact was class differentiated. Those who were able to escape the deadly fumes by car were found to have better survival rates and fewer long-term health repercussions, but those without vehicles who attempted to flee on foot, breathing in the toxic air, suffered more heavily. And in a gruesome anti-reproductive futurity twist, the toxic MIC gas, which was heavier than the surrounding air, settled close to the ground in the wake of the explosion, exposing smaller children to the highest concentrations. Women who were pregnant at the time of the gas leak experienced miscarriages at 10 times higher rates than the normal population. Roy continued. A 2009 review of clinical and experimental findings in Bhopal found that menstrual abnormalities, vaginal discharge, and premature menopause had emerged as common symptoms among MIC exposed women and their female offspring. So all in all, Deboleena Roy proposed, MIC is transforming life in intergenerational time. But while there is no question about pursuing reparations from the firms and governments involved, both Indian and transnational, whose negligence made this massacre, given the role of carbamate pesticides like Sevin and Temic in the Green Revolution, Roy further suggests, we should also understand MIC-mediated reproduction as having begun long before the 1984 industrial catastrophe. You've probably heard by now more about the surrogacy industry than was commonly known back in 2014, right? You've probably heard living human fetuses, you know, conceptualized as genetically authored private property, are among the many commodities whose manufacture can be outsourced to the global south and India in particular, or at least, as I say, until recently, before India kind of changed its regulatory framing for this. Gestational workers, you know, typically belonged to structurally adjusted proletarian geographies in India, standing fairly low on caste hierarchies and hailing from populations often classified as surplus to capital's requirements. Contract pregnancy gigs were represented to them by recruiters as opportunities to exit the misery of their class and caste. They did not contribute eggs, but only supposedly muscle. And their job was in general quite inadequately protected both in family and in labor law, locally or transnationally. The so-called intended parents were typically from the middle and upper classes of the same country, i.e. India, or as the surrogate, or else from the lower middle classes and up of overdeveloped nations elsewhere in the world. So after the industry recommended cesarean section that produces that commissioned offspring, these parents rarely continued whatever nominal relationship they conducted remotely with their carrier, quote unquote, during the 8 months prior. So the genetic blueprint of the desired fetuses, was what clients were in a sense paying for having actualized or realized. Clients are insistently invited by the clinicians to take, to imagine themselves as providing the design prior to having this transferred into embryo form. And so the surrogate worker was a sort of holding place, not a craft workwoman. Gestational labor was framed as passive and uncreative in this way. And it has been available to hire for a couple of decades in an ever-shifting constellation of parts of Southeast Asia, Central America, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. Ukrainian surrogacy was very much in the news in 2022. And the coverage of that reminded me of the grisly realities revealed in the Nepal earthquake of 2015, during which catastrophe the Israeli government sent in airlift support exclusively for its quote unquote own citizens on Nepali territory, a category which included the fetuses owned by Israeli commissioning couples that had only just exited or were even still inside the bodies of Nepali surrogates, but not the surrogates themselves, who were reportedly denied visas to Israel, while they and their precious cargo were temporarily held in Israeli hospitals. As one socialist writer remarked about this, the whole action demonstrated that fetuses that had been gestated in Nepal, so often the offspring of a non-Jewish mother and carried by a non-Jewish surrogate, could claim a birthright to the self-appointed Jewish state, while Palestinians literally born on that land could not. The contract pregnancy industry makes all kinds of amazing claims about where people come from, very different from my own story, right? They make amazing claims about how manufacturing new human beings works and what anthrogenesis is. Surrogacy clinicians and reproductive capitalists claim that the form-giving fire of willing proletarians' bodies the world over can be cleanly borrowed or hired or outsourced for the purposes of baby making via discrete exchanges that leave behind them no ghostly trail, no trace of their maker. In other words, gestational labor can be temporarily hired. These commissioning parents are assured on a genuinely finite and temporary contract, no more consequential to one's kinship, metaphysics, and sense of identity than a one-off arrangement with a pet sitter or someone off TaskRabbit. Indeed, part of the ontological framing that makes the brokerage of these rentals possible is a promise that as long as the genetic material of the would-be author or authors of the baby is successfully formatted into a zygote and presented for transfer, an impersonal uterine muscle will hygienically set about, effecting that design. Like an artist who barely touches the artwork she is officially authoring because she has a team of craftspeople and builders to do that for her, a person can become a mother literally in flesh without ever moving her body away from the realm of the screen. The intended procreator is thus reassured. Whoever the gestational muscle is part of will not leave the sticky filaments of her identity anywhere on the finished living product. The surrogate will have no more claim on that product than an egg cup does on its boiled egg. The baby will not be this person's kin. So you can perhaps see where I'm trying to go with this, if you pardon sort of embryonic thought experiment. The Bhopal disaster and its huge concentrations of MIC poisoning provide a very vivid example of a toxic reproductive stratification system. So whereas comparable gas disasters on American soil were cleaned up, such that American children could continue to be born, Bhopali life was left to suffocate, to weep, to suffer, infertility, to mutate. But this stratification might be turning out to be fairly liquid and leaky after all, failing to stay in its proper place. If gestational surrogates indeed, as they almost certainly have, been commissioned by parents from America to gestate American embryos, which then traveled to America upon being born, full of Bhopali flesh. Failing to stay in one's proper place is in fact exactly what gestational surrogates are accused of in the anxious imaginary of surrogacy service consumers. In Full Surrogacy Now, I focused on one such surrogacy capitalist's assurance that, and I quote, employee surrogates will not come knocking on the doors of the homes of the global north in order to reflect on what it would mean for gestational laborers to do just that, to come knocking on the doors of proprietarian kinship models. In this paper on germline ruptures and transpositions of life and death in Bhopal, mediated by MIC via gas disaster and baby-making industry, Roy proposed tracing the breaking down of Bhopali survivors' reproductive bodies, their genetics, and their liquids due to MIC exposure, and simultaneously examining the building up of new fetal bodies through the genetics and liquids provided by Bhopali surrogates. Liquids all over. And remember, it was simply water, a water tank, that triggered, as far as people think, the MIC gas holocaust. Amniotechnics is no laughing matter. It isn't pretty, and it's a matter of life or death, whether it creates conditions of flourishing or whether it drowns your kin. If chickens come home to roost, then during the Indian transnational surrogacy boom, Bhopali MIC made its way home via the bodies of surro-babies commissioned by American parents. My question is, can this circuit of historic molecular violence, whereby toxicity is returned to its place of origin through the labors of gestating bodies, tell us anything about the vengeful dimensions of hospitality and the cunning of a kind of botched amniotechnics? Is Jean-Luc Nancy right that we must endeavor to stay exposed? I recognize that this basically brings us back to the question, does what go around come around that I provided to you in my title? I suppose sometimes it's better to spend a lot of time getting a grip on one's question rather than venturing a premature set of conclusions. But for me, this story evokes a sensibility of responsibility and parentality and transgenerational enmeshment vis-a-vis this kind of motley and multitudinous crew of poisoned reproductive service workers, living and dead, that really brings into focus the stakes of a politics of reproductive liberation and full surrogacy. Is kinship a strong enough category for the practices of xeno-hospitality and xeno-solidarity that are so urgently necessary for living across the rifts of this damaged earth? I doubt it. I think we need something more than kinship, and I hope we can learn what that might be. I hope we can learn to treat each other carefully and responsibly like strangers. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sophie. This was thanks for this like wonderful and very kind of like complex and for this really great talk. I really I've been reading about Bhopal disaster from many different aspects, and the imaginary that comes with connecting this to idea of surro-babies. It's really like powerful sort of material reality of this toxicity coming back to the place, to this whole idea of what comes around, comes knocking on our door. I kind of wanted to ask, we have two questions. My question is kind of you've been sort of answering this question throughout your talk, especially in the final bit. And I wanted to ask you, maybe in the tone of your book, is another surrogacy possible? You know, is this sort of like knocking on the door one of these strategies that we can employ to imagine this sort of practice of decolonization? And so maybe like I would start with this question, and then I will have a look what we have in our chat. So if you can go maybe back to this like ideas of different, is another surrogacy possible? And maybe this is my personal sort of take on this. How can we, thank you especially for like concluding with this ideas of like care and mutual sort of like care for each other and imagining different sort of kinships. That when you said the kinship is not enough, that we need to think about like modes of care. So for me, it is like the important question is sort of like, how can we get to this affective stage when we can sort of build modes of relating and modes of relating and modes of desiring this sort of different kind of surrogacy, because obviously empathy is very difficult tool. How can we kind of like envision empathy of, you know, we can see it when it comes to Palestine conflict. I think like this when we think about like how dehumanizing it's the certain outlook on Palestinians, empathy is not something that is actually functional, because a lot of people are sort of in this situation that they dehumanize Palestinian population, so Palestinian people. So like maybe I just want to bring it back to this idea, how can we like envision different modes of surrogacy? Is another surrogacy possible? So yeah, so that's my first question.
Yeah, I think, well, my argument involves beginning with the recognition that some kind of latent surrogacy is everywhere already, as I said, which is not exactly a sort of pretty happy story. It's not nearly enough. It's actually maybe even the reverse, coming to sort of confront and face all of the, you know, it's difficult to find the right terminology. One could say debt, the sort of enmeshment, the indebtedness that we carry vis-a-vis invisibilized others, that we've gone to great lengths actually to be unable to see. That's not something I know exactly how to bring about. What are the material conditions for forcing such a confrontation and a recognition? I do think that maybe necessarily is some kind of beginning step, but there is also, you know, the good news, I suppose, is that there's also very sort of anti-proprietary, almost polymaternal, comradely ways of being in the world, reciprocally caring, you know, intergenerationally, right now as well, everywhere. Some of the best, you know, parents are, comradely rather than exclusionary and proprietary vis-a-vis those that they are sort of responsible sort of for. So there is this kind of sense in which, I wouldn't want to overstate this because then you sort of lose the politics entirely, but the politics of a sort of extended family, of neighbors, of, almost like public stranger care, is already part of the dynamic of surrogated co-responsibility that I guess proves to us that another surrogacy is possible. It's already possible to glimpse this other surrogacy even today. I would imagine that quite a lot has to change beyond even what we're capable of imagining fully in order for, the, in a sense, patriarchal institution of motherhood as a, an institution of proprietary sort of authorship almost, which is there to, help us, imagine selves, nations, inheritable bloodlines, and so on and so forth, without a world in which that institution has been radically sort of overturned in a context of anti-capitalist and communizing and decolonizing abundance, then, children would have a meaningful claim to being entitled to care from everyone almost, right? Which isn't to say that durable commitments wouldn't have to be figured out, in a sense, the way that sort of privatized kinship works today makes certain sort of difficulties of responsibility and relating maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say easier, but the poverty of the current way of organizing care does have a certain kind of, efficiency to it, without these containers for our relationships. Perhaps indeed kin making is more complicated, like we have to actually face one another and face one another's uncomfortable enmeshment in our own constitutedness, our own, flesh. But then again, in the absence of imperatives of, capitalist production and all the sort of immense amount of waste and, stolen time that the, domination of surplus value requires of the population of this earth, we would have time to figure all those difficult questions of kin making, and we would have time to figure that stuff out, and what could be more worthwhile and worthy of our time, in a sense.
I was actually when it comes to this in like Bhopal disaster, there was like some like a really interesting perspective, because it sort of figure out in this document about Vandana Shiva. I don't know if you've she's an Indian eco-activist, and she sort of like looks at recent conflict, like regional conflict in India, and she actually traces in this narrative, which is like labeled in Western media as sort of religious conflict, and she traces this like toxicity of this Bhopal disaster in 1984. So she kind of like traces this religious conflict, and she's actually like saying this, like, what are media not seeing, or Western media, what are they concealing, is the fact that this is not a religious conflict. This is a conflict that goes back to this like Bhopal disaster and kind of is connected to this idea of like green revolution. which cost so many lives. And what is like while I'm talking, the reason why I'm going back to it is maybe like maybe if we could kind of go back to this idea of what sort of like how can we, what I really was interested in was this ethical question that Vandana Shiva sort of presents, because for her is sort of this rejection of chemicals or Western sort of interference with food politics in India. That's like a cornerstone of her argument. She kind of like shows how sort of genetically modified seeds are sort of imported to India, and then they consequently ruin seed banks that Indian farmers have kept in their like homelands, you know. And so she sort of kind of like, for her, there's this like whole rejection of green revolution, and that's connected to this interferences in Indian food politics. There's obviously this counter argument that sort of blames her, you know, that sort of blames her for rejecting Western help when it comes to like tsunami disasters, when she actually initiated this refusal of another import of Western genetically modified food, which kind of her critiques kind of like connected to like starvation of local population. So I was kind of like interested in this like modes of solidarity, you know, how can we forge this modes of solidarity among like actually surrogates who are actually among these gestational workers. So we can kind of think about so it's sort of different perspectives. Are there any sort of like practical, if you could maybe tell us whether there are some practical steps in Indian gestational surrogacy that are trying to like self-organize or respond in similar way, like Vandana Shiva is like turning this argument to the idea of organic farming, etc. So I wondered whether Indian gestational surrogate workers are forming any sort of initiatives that would sort of like try to, you know, to address the question that you've been asking in this lecture.
Yeah.
So I went around in like very long sort of like, you know, but I'm interested in this mode of solidarity that
Yeah.
actually like self-initiated in you know, in the global south. Yeah. So
Of course.
yeah.
I mean, I shared very much with you this curiosity and bias in favor of these sorts of discourses, such as they might be traceable by someone who was relying on, you know, other people's on the ground research. I remained desk bound when I was looking at surrogacy as a theorist, but interestingly, you know, the proposal on the part of some surrogate workers in Bangalore to make a surrogacy cooperative that would actually be run by themselves was, you know, it was discussed by Sharmila Rudrappa, this wonderful scholar, who was actually asked by these workers whether she could help advise them and link them up with potential commissioning parents, you know, in the United States, for example, where Sharmila sometimes lives. And you know, it's an interesting moment for an anthropologist as well, because, you know, it's one of these moments where you get confronted almost with the I mean, I'm putting myself in Sharmila's shoes here and extrapolating from what she writes about this moment, you know, where in a sense she's receiving a proposal to act as a kind of you know, agent almost, you know, so a go-between for some surrogacy business. And it was, you know, I'm not sure Sharmila went very far down this route of trying, but it became clear to her when she asked speculatively the commissioning parents in her study that the buyers, whether they were Indian or non-Indian, were not going to trust. They said, I would not trust a surrogacy cooperative with no hierarchical or managerial layer, you know, and that in itself, I think, is very indicative and interesting. I don't think that surrogacy cooperative got off the ground, but it was there as a proposal and as an idea. Right now, you know, this particular industry transnationally is not and I think even domestically right now, I haven't followed it. I'm sorry, Hana, but right now I know that there is you can't go to India to buy a surro baby, you know, to commission a surrogate transnationally right now. There was some interesting politics around that as well. Some nationalist, almost like bio-nationalist formations of feminism in India that were, you know, very much contested as well by feminists connected with the sort of surrogacy workers' demands for better, you know, pay, for more healthcare entitlements and so on, saying, you know, that outlawing commercial surrogacy tout court was very much not in the interests of, you know, women per se, in any straightforward sense. And so this is very much the same kind of bifurcation in feminism that you see around sex work and the sex industry, you know, this idea that we fight from the ground up in and against capitalist work and capitalist exploitation, rather than, as you know, as the prohibitionists or you know, so-called, you know, prostitution abolitionists would say, you know, going over the heads of the people exploited in the industry to sort of almost rescue them from their professions in a humanitarian mode, right? But and very much the same sort of conversation was happening in India. But as far as I understand, and again, you know, commercial surrogacy is no longer the industry it was in 2015 in India, right? But there was some really interesting forms of solidarity between, you know, agricultural union militants and sort of surrogacy clinic workers, sort of representatives. It was always, I think, still getting off the ground and was not at a very high level of coordination or organization at the point where it was illegalized. But again, I wish I could have more concrete information for you. It's just, I think to go back to your more broad sort of inquiry about this, like, I think, you know, the moments where surrogacy and the whole concept of, you know, parenthood qua property, quasi-property relation has been politicized on the global stage, have been these moments of, you know, hyper sentimental kind of drama of the kind that, you know, daytime television adores. You know, surrogacy is such a favorite topic of, you know, melodrama, sort of infotainment, you know, for the reason that what tends to happen is, you know, the gestational mother, as in the case of Patramon Chanbua, a Thai surrogate who refused to abort one of her commissioned fetuses who had Down syndrome, and the villains in the story became the commissioning parents from Australia. And so the sort of the intensity of the, you know, the courageous single solitary surrogates, you know, determination to care, you know, became the subject of a giant international sort of wave of support, you know, and then condemnation for the craven, you know, white parents or so on, you know. But I think what this is not, I think, a level on which anything good can come politically, that kind of opposition. I think it's very dangerous, in fact, to enter into these sorts of areas where also, you know, gay and, you know, infertile couples who may wish to you know, work with a surrogate in order to create a baby get lumped into this category of sort of unnatural, extractive, sort of greedy, you know, bourgeois parents, you know, who don't have the right to be parents and so on. I think we need to really resist these sorts of, you know, attempts to bifurcate people into, you know, natural and unnatural when it comes to parenthood, right? So I mean, maybe that's also very abstract, but I think, yeah, when it comes to, you know, the sorts of transnational solidarities that you're, you know, pushing me to concretize a little bit, I think, yeah, we you know, we could concentrate on the politics of you know, refugees, of like maybe that sounds too basic, but like right now locally in the global north, in the global core, we can concentrate on you know, demanding that borders be opened to refugees, be it from Palestine or Yemen or wherever, you know, on the basis that you know, we feel implicated, because we can start creating those discourses whether we use kinship or not, right? You know, they need to come here because we are there, or we are there because, you know, or they are here because we were there, you know, having this kind of recognition that our everyday commodities, our phones, and yes, our food, our bodies, therefore, you know, are co-constituted by people very far away, whose you know, responsibility for our lives we have outsourced literally from, you know, not just physically and geographically, but also you know, metaphysically, like intellectually, we've outsourced all knowledge of them, you know, to other people. That might be a starting point. You know, I remember when I was a student, it was quite powerful to connect students' struggles around you know, fast fashion to the struggles around sweatshops by physically bringing out the clothes from the big sort of high street chains, and pointing out, you know, because when there's something tangible like that, it's easier to sort of point out what you mean, you know, like literally these labels were sewn in by children, you know, like why is this tank top, you know, £1.50 like in the UK, where, you know, like these sorts of, yeah, direct entanglements can be a starting point, perhaps. I know it feels very like yeah, modest, especially, but the stuff around children is such a legal morass, you know, like this is why surrogacy has been an interesting thing to intervene in during a period of its reconstitution and its crisis, and its in a sense it's had to catch up very rapidly as a transnational legal regime with the already existing, you know, material reality of people making babies in this way. And so stateless, you know, neonatal humans were being generated, you know, people didn't know what to make of them, you know, because nationalism depends on all these fictions of sort of biogenetic authorship. And so, yeah, I mean, I think as the left, we had an opportunity. I don't know if we still have this opportunity. It might already have closed a little bit as a window, this surrogacy question. I don't know. It'll reopen in a different way. But we had an opportunity to sort of say more courageous things, I think, about how children don't belong to anybody qua property, and that the way to do solidarity with gestational workers in contract pregnancy as an industry is not to tell them you know, what it is that they want, you know, to assume that what a gestational mother wants is the baby, simply. You know what, people want a lot of other things, such as a right to share in the material abundance of the commissioning parents, for example, you know, to have a world of reproductive justice in the expanded sense, which is not simply the right to have or not have children, but to also care for the children who already exist amongst us and with us in a safe and healthy environment.
Yeah, on practical level, it is, you know, so many of my friends, you know, just sort of routinely express how it's extremely difficult for them to parent in this like nuclear units, you know, unless they happen to have like family very close by, that actually it is so problematic to actually build up this network of friends because the system is so positioned against you to kind of like actually bring a child together communally. So this like unhappiness is really like articulated, and I was kind of like thinking about you know, this might be like my last question, or like last point I would like to make is, you know, because you are writing a book which is called Enemy Feminisms, if I'm correct. I don't have a paper in front of me, or so you know. So I also want to note on this use of like language in your lecture. First of all, I was very much impressed in the way you connect this like new material theory with like indivisibility and individualism, and then like this sort of like microchimerism and the body that is that has this multiplicity as a like political project. And I really thought that it was really interesting the way you talk about the way this language of this my body, your body is sort of appropriated by fascist sort of like critique of abortion. So no one, and I really thought that this rephrasing, you know, no one should be ever pregnant against their will, is something that is not sort of said often strongly enough. Because we, in Czech context, we found out recently that it's like a movement called, we call it in media anti-gender. And Druhá směna, or Maya and Eliška, who you spoke to, they kind of published several articles about it in also Alarm did. And they found out that one of the aims of this anti-gender movement was rephrasing a notion of protection. So they wanted to use this idea of like pregnant people should be pregnant people should have like a pregnancy protection, you know. And so this like softening of this violence of like restriction, you know. So obviously, once you register with your gynecologist, you have special protection, and under this protection, they would sort of legally insert more and more restriction when you can like abort, effectively forcing on you this violence of being pregnant against your will. So I find this like use of language, you know, this kind of like a language so sort of powerful when we kind of think about these bodily experiences that we experience. And perhaps I wanted, because the language is so important to, you know, the way you started with full surrogacy now, it was also almost like a manifesto, you know, when you describe this like kind of a placenta humans have, and it is like you know, you use language in a very powerful way. So I wanted to maybe kind of ask you how this like enemy feminism, how this is articulated in your like future project, and what can we expect from this, yeah. So you can either like respond to this, like if you have still energy. I think it's more like a comment. I just thought it was really, really interesting, this kind of like, how can you answer to someone who tells you, but your body is not just yours, you know, and this idea of like, you have to recognize my multiplicity, there is multiplicity. And if you say my body is not just yours. You have to recognize there can be trans body, there can be body that don't confirm certain expectation, what you expect my body to be. So that was like, you know, like this idea of like using language, but I thought that this sort of anti-gender like use of language, that they sort of like define this when you say no one should be ever pregnant against their will. I think that's like incredibly powerful statement, because we phrase these questions often very differently, and equally, not equally, but this is this worrying trend of like anti-gender movements in the Czech Republic specifically, when they try to use this language of protection to sort of like enforce extreme violence on pregnant people. So I wanted to ask you, maybe if you can kind of tell us maybe about your enemy feminisms, this sort of like this kind of language is like articulated in your like what can we look forward to in your future sort of like book and project, etc. Yeah.
Thank you for this comment, and also for the pleasure of having you as an interlocutor generally. You know, I really admire your thought and scholarship, and it's a genuine pleasure to be part of this, and I appreciate the invitation so much. Looking forward to more conversations with you in future. But yeah, so I think, you know, the project in general, I could say a few words about, but I'm also really interested in the very specific kind of questions you are raising about almost a pro-life or anti-abortion feminism that refers to itself in the as feminism, and that is in fact one of the chapters of my book. So enemy feminisms is my it's finished. It's not going to be out for a few more months for various reasons to do with publishing, but it's an intervention that seeks to you know, strengthen our courage collectively as almost anti-fascist feminists in saying there are feminisms that really are feminisms that are part of what we are fighting, you know. This is maybe a minor point, but it also seems to me valuable, because what we prefer to do on the left, I think, as feminists, is to say, oh, femo-nationalists, TERFs, you know, anti-sex worker feminists, they're not real feminists, you know, and so on. So there's this kind of preference, you know, to almost purify the domain of feminism and claim that for ourselves. I don't think it works. I don't think if you look through the history, and I attempt, in a sense, to draw a thread through, you know, 2 centuries of feminism, it doesn't work to try and purify that. And even the analyses of white feminism, I think, can be expanded upon, because in 2018, many books in the Anglo sphere came out about the problems with white feminism. I don't say that those are bad in any sense. I think most of them are pretty good. Some of them are great. You know, there are ways in which I think some of them fantasize that if you just kind of supplement the story of feminism, and you just kind of fill in a little bit what was left out, or the people who are left out, you know, then you can still have your nice category feminism, which is sort of accountable to itself and so on, right? But I don't think that quite works. I don't think it's strong enough. I think we could in fact benefit strategically for anti-fascism purposes by saying something stronger, which is that there are projects of gender emancipation associated with certain genders, you know, which I want to say are historically and, you know, colonially specific genders, which are indeed really feminism coherently so. They have a project of gender emancipation, but the problem is that, you know, that they want something very anti-liberatory in general. They are an enemy feminism. The gender that they are standing for is already, in a sense, the problem. It already is enmeshed in categories of property and racial differentiation. I realize there is a question from Maya, which I'm happy to see, but I'll very briefly just continue just for a second about the question of the language around fighting against forced birth, and I have sort of proposed, controversially, that we might wish to, break out of the deadlock with the opponents of abortion. When they talk about abortion as killing, I think we have to be really morally mature in the sense of, Donna Haraway and Lynn Margulis and all of the, in fact, biologists that I've been talking about for the last hour and a half, to understand how much killing is unfortunately already part of our everyday sort of, traffic with other, bodies and biomes. Not that that's something I want to say is okay, right? It's just that, our commitment to anti-violence should never be a sentimental fantasy of non-violence. So maybe that's complex, but, the ethical imperative, thou shalt not make killable, counterintuitively, doesn't for me mean that we should deny simply that abortion has a feticidal element, right? The distinction between making fetuses killable and making it easy and stigma-free for people to take the decision to kill a fetus, that's a difference that is significant. The former, the sort of making a fetus killable is that's casting something out of the sphere of the grievable, thanks to a sort of tidy and final verdict on the permissibility of systematically, sacrificing its life to a greater cause. But I'm talking about, expanding access to the means, yes, of feticide, which you have to trust people to make the decision to get into, and that does not require a sanitization of violence. There are feminists, pro-life feminists, who were very instrumental in striking down Roe versus Wade in the US, and they hope, in the pages of the New York Times, that people like us will acquire, moral maturity, right? Because for them, it seems like, the idea of a pregnant person putting her own desires first and killing a conceptus out of self-interest, and repudiating motherhood in favor of some other project is supposed to be morally repellent enough to pass for an argument, But I think we have to be able, to meet that argument where it is, and to say we are simply not morally repelled enough to be scared away from abortion by this browbeating and by this identification of the place of killing in all life making. And I mean, just to say, we're not really sufficiently skilled, I think, at going on the offensive against this sickening version of vitalism. I don't want to live in a world that valorizes life for its own sake. I think the task of feminism is to think about, making the world that prioritizes lives chosen and wanted. Okay, I'll now read what the question from the, let's see.
I wanted to say that one point is for me. I need to correct myself that this anti-gender debate was actually led by Eliška Koldová and Magdalena Dušková, because I made a mistake. So I just want to put it absolutely clear. Obviously, druhá směna is supporting research and publishes a lot of feminist texts dealing with these subjects. But the research on anti-gender was actually led by Magdalena Dušková and Eliška Koldová. Okay, so you can.
Yeah, I mean, probably we should wrap up in a second, but thank you for this. The question is also about whether I decided to change the framing of my project from feminism of fools to enemy feminisms. Yes, I still have the analysis, but it turns out not everybody is a nerd about 19th century sort of categories. I'm very interested in the the debate within Marxism about how this phrase, the socialism of fools, refers to a truncated analysis of capitalism that ends up as anti-Semitism and fascism, essentially, because of its fantasy that you can almost cut off elements of the organic or concrete or natural economy from the predations of financialization or commodification, or so you get anti-Semitism as a socialism of fools, a left, quote unquote, anti-Semitism, which is conspiracism and basically becomes fascism very fast, because you're failing to sort of almost stay with the trouble of capitalism's circuits and how far they reach even into our intimate lives. There is no sort of pure place that you can save from the contamination of the the enemy, which people rightly identify as a problem. That's the tragedy of the socialism of fools. In a way, it recognizes that something is deeply wrong about capitalism. It just ends up producing such a terribly wrong and bad answer to what that problem is, that it lurches into the enemy camp, right, the wrong side of history. So when I say feminism of fools, I was hoping to immediately make this analogy plain, but I think, well, you can tell me different, Maya, but I think enemy feminisms has its own virtues as a phrase. It shocks people too, and it has the benefit of not being misunderstood as, going around calling people foolish or idiots, for espousing the wrong brand of feminism, which is not really my point at all. In fact, this whole book is a bit of a love letter to, feminism in many ways. Thank you so much for this, for listening to me for so long, and for having me in this sort of fascinating project in Slovakia.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and thanks for such a fascinating lecture that brings all these different aspects of feminist, queer, decolonial and ecological perspectives together into this fascinating framework of reproductive health, which is something that is so sort of concerning all of us and has potential actually kind of bring different perspective on kinship, parenthood, and us being together here in the future of ecological ruin, which is a positive, not the most positive note, but thank you, Sophie, and good luck with your book. And thank you, Transit, for hosting this lecture. Thank you, Judith, for inviting me. And please go to see the show. The show is open until 15th of March. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you to Hana and Sophie. Thank you very much.
I switched on. Thank you, Sophie. I don't know if you are